Hey everybody, welcome to Algo Expert. In this video, we're going to go over some general tips on how you can do very well in your behavioral interviews. Now, as I mentioned in the previous video that we have here in the behavioral interviews content on Algo Expert, there is no right or wrong answer to most behavioral interview questions. In other words, if you're asked something like, tell me about a challenging project, or tell me about a time that you handled conflict in the workplace, there is no objectively wrong or right way to answer those questions. There is no objectively better challenging project, and there is no objectively better way to handle conflict in the workplace. That being said, there are better ways to answer these two questions, and there are worse ways to answer these two questions. I realize that this is a little bit of a convoluted way of thinking about this, but hopefully you understand what I'm getting at. So let's start by talking about a couple of things that you certainly want to avoid doing in behavioral interviews because they will make your answers just be poor answers. It's not that they'll be incorrect answers, but they will be either delivered poorly or they will be highlighting things that you don't really want to highlight. So the first thing hopefully goes without saying, but it's always helpful to repeat it. You do not want, under any circumstance, in a behavioral interview or in any other interview for that matter, but you do not want to be disrespectful, to be offensive, mean, arrogant, confrontational. All of these qualities or anti-qualities, whatever you want to call them, you don't want to be. So you don't want to deliver your answers in a way that makes you come across as disrespectful. You don't want to be confrontational with your interviewer. And similarly, you don't want to talk about past experiences or share stories about yourself that make you seem disrespectful or arrogant. These are qualities that, the grand majority, if not all companies, will not want in their employees and in their software engineers. So that's the first thing to avoid. The second thing that you want to avoid doing in behavioral interviews is you want to avoid being too vague in your answers. And I mentioned this a little bit in the previous video, but in a behavioral interview, just like in a coding interview or in a systems design interview, your interviewer is looking for signal. They're looking for signal of something from you. In a coding interview, they're looking for signal about your coding skills, your coding ability, etc., or your algorithms and data structures knowledge. In a behavioral interview, they're looking for signal that you have those nuanced software engineering skills that we've talked about, for signal that you've got those qualities that we talked about. And to give that signal, you need to share enough information. You need to go into enough detail about your past experiences and your past stories. Otherwise, your interviewers will simply not get enough signal. So that means not being vague when you're describing situations or projects or things that you've done in the past. Not being vague when you're explaining how you handled those things, whom you worked with, how you reacted to certain events. And not being vague when you describe the things that you learned from those events, the things that you decided to do after whatever situations you were in. So you have to not be vague, you have to be detailed. Those are really the two main things that you want to avoid doing in a behavioral interview, being either disrespectful and whatever comes with that, or being too vague in your answers. Now, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about things that you do want to do, things that will make your answers better answers. Number one, you want to try to strike a balance in your answers between highlighting very good qualities about yourself as an individual. For example, that you're smart, you're intellectually curious, you can lead projects. All of those things are things about you. And that's great. You certainly want to highlight qualities about you. But you want to strike a balance between that and between your ability to work in a team, your ability to help others. Because as you can imagine, and as we explained in the previous videos, able to work as part of a team, being a good team player, being helpful to others, being able to mentor others. These are all qualities that most employers look in their employees, or look for in their employees and in their software engineers. So you want to strike a balance between those two things. Now this leads me to the second tip, or the second thing that you want to try to do. And this is, you want to try to answer behavioral interview questions with stories or past experiences that highlight those things that I just talked about, or that have a good balance of those things. So, as an example, you don't want every single one of your answers in behavioral interview questions to be about how you are a great team player and you can always help others, but never talking about how you take initiative or how you can write very complex code or how you can handle, pressure at work. You don't want to have just the team stuff. Similarly, you don't want to have just stuff about how you are amazing, you are the best, you're able to do this and that without mentioning your teammates. You want to make sure that you have stories that can highlight both of those things. And what that means is that you likely will have to prepare a little bit, and this is, by the way, a common theme throughout this entire video, that you do want to prepare for these behavioral interviews a little bit. You'll want to prepare by thinking about all of your past experiences, all of your professional experiences, or perhaps your experiences outside of work but that were related to software engineering, and think which ones can highlight all of these things, right? Which ones will be good to highlight when we're talking about teamwork? Which ones will be good to highlight when we're talking about leadership? So you want to make sure that you've done enough advanced preparation or given enough advanced thought such that you have all of these stories and past experiences kind of, readily available to talk about. And of course, you want to be prepared enough to talk about them in detail. Right? You want to be able to not be vague. So again, this is another reason that you want to prepare, because you don't want to be caught off guard where someone asks you about a challenging project, you blurt out that, oh yeah, you worked on a huge project that you led, but then you don't remember any of the details. No, you want to prepare in advance for that. Now, this leads me to the third general tip, which is that sometimes I'll hear from people who tell me, I have this one past experience that I think would be great to share if I'm asked, 1, 2, 3 behavioral interview questions, but it's a little bit annoying because it's got a lot of additional context that I could provide to the interview, or to the interviewer, but that context wouldn't really be useful. It would just be like clutter, and it would just, add noise to the interview or to the answer. Or maybe someone will say, I have this great past experience and, I think I handled it well and blah, blah, blah. It would be worth sharing, but I didn't really, at the time, extract lessons from it. I didn't learn lessons from it only maybe a year after, or only now that I'm really thinking about it, do I realize that I learned some valuable lessons from it. How can I, put those two things together? What I'm getting at here is that when you're going to be answering behavioral interview questions, you want to have the best stories and the best past experiences that will highlight all of the things that we've mentioned over and over again. And sometimes your actual real life experiences or stories will not be perfect. They'll be imperfect and they won't be able to convey the things that you want to convey. It's fine if you have to tweak those stories a little bit to fit the interview. Now, very important caveat here, I'm not advocating that you lie or that you make stuff up. No, because that's never going to be helpful. The truth will always come out. You don't want to lie or make stuff up. But if you need to, either adorn a story or a past experience with something else by adding a lesson that you think you could have learned from it, that you realize now after the fact, or if you want to, remove some unnecessary context that would just add noise and devalue the rest of the answer, by all means, do so. And that's totally fine. Okay, of course, use your judgment. Again, I'm not advocating that you lie or that you make things up. Those will often just not be good ways to handle what I'm saying here. But if you have to tweak a past experience a little bit, that's totally fine. Now, on this note, perhaps a better option than this is probably the fourth tip now, is if you're asked in a behavioral interview, a question that wants you to describe a time that something happened to you. So for example, I'll take one of the questions that we have here on Algo Expert. Describe a time when there was a low performer on your team. How did you handle the situation? Did you help them? How did you help them? And so on and so forth. It's possible that you've actually never had that experience. You've never had a time with a low performer on your team. Maybe you've only worked on rockstar teams, or maybe you've only worked on one team and it just didn't have that issue, right? That's totally plausible. If that's the case, what you can definitely do is you can tell your interviewer, well, I don't think I've actually had this experience, but I'd love to tell you how I would react or how I would behave in this circumstance. And there you go. Suddenly, you are getting the best of both worlds because you can answer the question almost as if it had been an ideal scenario without having to make up a story or, make up a past experience. So that's something to keep in mind, and I think it can be very useful. Basically, any question that is asked in such a way or that is asked in the format of describe a time, tell me about a time that this happened to you, you can always flip those questions into what would I do if that were to happen? And that's totally fine, or mostly fine. Ideally, you'll still have some personal experiences for some questions. You won't have to imagine for every question, but it's fine if you do for some. Now, the final tip that I'll mention here is going to be just your general communication skills. As you can imagine, not only are communication skills very important in all interviews, we highlight this, for coding interviews, systems design interviews, but for behavioral interviews, since you're just talking for the entire duration of the interview, your communication skills are particularly important. Now, people often misinterpret communication skills with either, extroversion or having a loud voice or even being a great public speaker. That's not the case here. You certainly don't have to be extroverted or have a loud voice. Some of the best communicators don't have those traits, but you also don't necessarily have to be a great public speaker. What you have to do is you have to be able to convey the stories and the past experiences in a succinct manner, a concise manner. So you don't want to be too short and too vague, but you don't want to be too detailed and too rambly. And here, by the way, I'll be the first to admit that I tend to err on that other side. I tend to sometimes ramble a little bit. And that's something that I try to work on and that I try to limit myself. So that's one of the ways that you can improve your communication skills in behavioral interviews. And again, we go back to the theme of preparation. The more you prepare, the more you'll be in that sweet spot of not too vague and too short, but not too, detailed and rambly. And also just for communication, it's speaking with confidence and really highlighting or extracting the most important aspects of the stories that you're sharing. And once again, here we go back to preparation. The more thought you give to potential answers to potential behavioral interview questions, the more confident you'll be when you speak, and the better things you'll be able to highlight and extract from your past experiences. So all in all, for communication, it's really a matter of preparing ahead of time. And here, I'll add one last thing, which is that depending on the type of individual that you are, some people really enjoy talking and they feel like they can talk forever. They can answer these behavioral interview questions on the spot pretty easily. Others aren't like that. And if you're someone who's not like that, then you might really want to prepare ahead of time. You might want to record yourself answering questions. You might want to just rehearse some of the answers to questions multiple times. And that's totally fine. Just do what works for you. Now, the last thing, closing thoughts on the general tips for behavioral interviews, is the best way, in my opinion, to prepare for them, because I keep saying that you should prepare, is to go through a bunch of behavioral interview questions, think about how you would answer them. So give a mock answer that you come up with, then ideally see what other people would say, how other people would answer them, and of course we provide you with sample answers to the dozen behavioral interview questions that we've got here on Algo Expert. So watch the videos and see how I answer them, and then, based on that, reformulate an answer. Ask yourself, was my answer good? Maybe you don't have to change it, or maybe you're inspired by something that I said and you think that you can tweak your answer a little bit, you can highlight something a little bit more, and that's how you can prepare. And what we've done here with the sample questions and answers is we've really tried to give you an example of what real answers might look like. So the dozen questions that we have on the platform, I answered them, as you'll see, in a very real way. In other words, I prepared them a little bit, just as I'm advocating that you prepare for questions. But then I filmed myself, giving them with no script, no nothing, no timer, just as I would if I were in a real interview. So you'll see, imperfect examples of what answers would be, and that's precisely what you should see, because an interview will always be imperfect, and it'll always be, at the end of the day, impromptu, because you don't know what you'll be asked, and you'll have to speak, off the top of your mind without notes or a script. So with that, hopefully you've captured all of these general tips. You'll keep them in mind as you prepare for your behavioral interviews and as you actually go and take them. I'll say one final thing for real is that these behavioral interviews should not be taken as something too stressful. In fact, if you prepare and if you go through the questions that we give you here, the behavioral interview should almost be like a fun thing to do, something where you get to kind of relax a little bit from the technical stuff. Just make sure that you have put some preparation into them. With that, I hope that this video is informative, and I'll see you in the next one.